Well, good morning all and welcome to this webinar on scenarios for a post-pandemic future. There's a lot of people signed up for this session, no idea how many will actually join, but I'm going to get going anyway and welcome you all and thank you all for coming along to be part of this. My aim this morning is to really take you through the scenarios at the beginning of the book. Well, let me start by just telling you a little bit about the story of the book and where it came out from. Back in March, Steve Wells, Alex and I were talking about, what could we do to really help people think beyond the current crisis? And as a publisher, as well as futurists and speakers, we thought it'd be good to do something that we've done before, which is to bring a number of future thinkers together from around the world to explore their ideas of what a post-pandemic future might look like in order to help policymakers, individuals, business leaders, civil society really get their heads around what do we need to prepare for and how might the future be different? How could we prepare for a range of possibilities? And how do we arm ourselves with the insights to make good choices? And so we put a call out, I think it was the 20th of March, and we were expecting maybe 40 contributors to suggest chapters. We ended up with 115. So we've actually now split the best of those proposals into two books. This first book coming out on June the 1st is an exploration of kind of the broader patterns of change and broader scenarios. And then a second one coming out in August is going to look more deeply into specific topics, from the future of retirement to deep dives into education and the future of particular countries and regions. So hopefully that gives you some context for this. Also, just to set things in context as well, we want to make clear that scenarios are not predictions. People often get confused between a scenario and a prediction or a forecast. Scenarios are about exploring all the different forces, or many of the key ones, that could come together to shape our future and to explore the different possible outcomes. You're not trying to predict the future. You're trying to say, what are the critical factors that have the most influence and around which there's the greatest uncertainty? And how might they then come together to create different possible scenarios for the future? We've also taken the view that we only want to focus on the next 2 to 3 years in this particular book. We haven't gone much further except a couple of chapters. And that's very deliberate because we think people are struggling to think long term. And so what that means is we haven't really gone for the very extreme ends of the scenario, of the spectrum. So we haven't looked at the possible Armageddon scenarios, complete anarchy, total meltdown, nor have we gone for the other end of the spectrum of, everything's going to be fantastic by September, we're going to see hockey stick growth, as being suggested by some government leaders and central banks. We've gone for something, maybe that covers 60% of the possibility spectrum. And I'm not going to do a full explanation of scenario planning, but the approach we use is called the driving force model. And basically what that involves is identifying what you consider to be the driving forces. What are the factors that could have the most influence on how things play out? And then to pick out the two that you think are the most uncertain and that could have the most impact, but are also least correlated, and to then explore how they might play out when they interact, particularly when you add in the other forces. So we chose two. One was an obvious one we thought was the evolution of the pandemic, with two ends of the spectrum there. And secondly, the economic recovery. And some might say, but these two are related. But what we can see already is there's a rhetoric rising around the world that says we'll have parallel paths. We'll deal with the pandemic now, but we're going to get on with the economic recovery. And we may have the pandemic still raging away, but we could also have the economy moving forward. So we've taken the view that they're not as correlated as some might think. And that leaves us with four scenarios. What we call the long goodbye, down in the bottom left quadrant, safe but hungry, where we eradicate the pandemic, but we have a serious downturn. The VIP economy, where things pick up economically, but we don't control the pandemic. And then what we're talking about as inclusive abundance. And I'll come back to those in a few minutes to talk through those in more detail. But what I want to start with is talking about the underlying drivers and those two ends of the spectrum that we've been working with. So the first is the shape of the economic recovery. And what we see is the ends of the spectrum we're talking about. One end is this idea of a prolonged downturn with a very slow recovery, very nationalistic views around how we deal with this, countries looking very inward, very protectionist in their approaches, very little global collaboration. And it's not in this scenario, or at this end of the spectrum, it's not until later in 2021 that we start to come together to deal with this as a global issue. The other end of our spectrum is where we do get a reasonably robust bounce back, countries innovation-led in their recovery programs, jobs are recreated, and there's a focus on more sustainable recovery for the whole planet. Underlying that are the kind of GDP factors, which are obviously important. At the kind of base end of the spectrum, then the talk there is of potentially a -6% fall in GDP this year, which covers up the fact that some countries like the US, people are talking about potentially a 20% fall. UK, we're talking about maybe 15%. Other countries could be between 10 and 30% declines. So that's quite a bleak picture. In our view, that if that was the case, then you'd end up with perhaps -2, -3% next year on GDP growth. And under this more bleak scenario, we don't get back to either flat growth or maybe up to 2% growth until 2022. The more optimistic end says that we would see a fall of about 3% in GDP this year, turning into a 4 to 6% level of growth next year globally, and then the same in 2022, and sort of continuing from there on at that kind of level. The next is around the evolution of the pandemic. So at one end of the spectrum is the spectre, if you like, of an uncontrolled pandemic. We're at about just under 5 million cases right now. We could move, under this scenario, you could be up around 10 million cases and 3 million deaths. And really countries focusing very inwardly on how they deal with it, very little coordinated effort to deal with the countries most at risk. And there are certainly a lot of countries that would be under a big concern here, where the pandemic is likely to spread rapidly, whether that's Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, or highly populous, more developing nations like Brazil, Mexico, India, and Pakistan. The concern is that they really wouldn't recover well, and that you'd still continue to see a rise in infection and deaths in a lot of those countries in 2021, and it wouldn't come under control and start to dip until 2022. In the more developed economies, some would get it under control, some might have secondary peaks, but it would take a long time for it to work through. And the US would be the big concern here, that the US really wouldn't come under control and would see secondary and tertiary peaks through into next year until we started to see maybe some more effective controls. The other end of the spectrum is more positive. We're looking at maybe only 6 million cases and 500,000 deaths this year, and it really falling everywhere, and a really globally coordinated effort to put in place the health infrastructure, the testing, the tracking, the tracing, the quarantine, and the cures and vaccinations into pretty much every country on the planet, so that we really do control the global spread of this and move towards eradication by 2022. Taking that a little bit deeper to look at the viral spread, we've already talked about the numbers there, but this is one where people truly understand how global this is, how it's born on aircraft effectively. It travels around the world with people, and the real questions here are about what kind of level of control would there be on people traveling. In the worst case scenario, you could see many countries trying to lock their borders to the countries with the worst infections. In the best case, we're talking about people lifting travel bans quite quickly because there are antibody and vaccination solutions available much faster than we might hope. In terms of testing vaccination then, the numbers vary, but we would say that in the worst case scenario, you'd see less than 20% globally getting antigen testing to see if they've got the virus, and maybe less than 10% getting antibody testing. And that picking up very slowly in 2021, 2022. In the best case scenario, some are talking about the capacity to test 50% this year for antigen to see if they've got the virus, and close to maybe 20% to see if they've got antibodies. On the vaccination front, in the worst case scenario, you're talking about no vaccine really until 2022, and potentially only 25% of the global population vaccinated by the end of that year. Best case scenario, I think, without going for the kind of wild claims being made, would be that there was a vaccination available at the beginning of next year. And the manufacturers certainly tell us that they would have the capacity to roll out vaccination to 50% of the planet by the end of next year. So that would be the kind of optimistic picture. From a political perspective, at one end of the spectrum, we've looked at the idea of countries turning more inwardly, becoming more nationalistic, a lot of social strife, potentially riots, civil unrest, and a lot of discord between nations at one end of the spectrum, and no real coming together till later next year to try and deal with this as a global issue. On the other end of the spectrum is the idea that actually countries begin to realize this needs a global solution, in the same way as the G7 and G20 came together to really prevent the global financial crisis turning into a total meltdown. We need to do something similar, where perhaps those groups plus the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the African Union, the European Union, ASEAN, World Bank, IMF, UN, World Health Organization, really come together to say, how do we solve this as a global set of challenges, which starts again, as I say, with health infrastructure. From a business perspective, then the kind of worst end of the spectrum that we looked at, this is where businesses gradually come out of lockdown, start to realize that in many cases they have no custom, their business has gone away, it's not coming back. You see a lot of closures, second and third waves of redundancies as people come off their furlough schemes, which would drive down their expectations of revenues this year for most businesses. Some sectors are obviously doing very well, but for a lot of sectors, their revenues would be down. They'd be setting lower budgets for this year, which means the amount they're ordering and investing would be down, which would have a knock-on effect then through the supply chain into 2021, where again, people would be setting lower expectations, lower budgets, which would roll through and potentially roll through until 2022 before you started to see any kind of real signs of significant recovery. The other end of the spectrum is the hope that businesses bounce back. There's a kind of desire to really drive things forward, a strong investment in green technologies and innovation as part of recovery deals and bailout packages being offered by governments. This would very much be a bank-led thing as well, with banks being willing to loan to businesses for investment and development of new opportunities, getting into new sectors, pioneering new technologies. You could see a lot of focus in this scenario on automation and AI, but also to go with that investment in reskilling, in digital literacy, and in helping people acquire the skills to either find new jobs or create their own jobs for the future. On the consumer side, on the kind of negative end of the spectrum, this is where consumer trust really starts to erode. People become very nervous. There might be a little bounce back once the lockdowns lift and people want to go out and make some essential purchases, but then a retrenchment. And you're already seeing this in terms of the savings rates going up across the planet. And with rising unemployment, this feeling that people really have to focus on themselves and their own needs. The other end of the spectrum is this sense that when the lockdown lifts, people really start to feel a feel-good factor again. Jobs get created, particularly in the new sectors. And there's a growing sense of what can we do for the community? How do we make sure those left behind get more included, and a real community focus on that? And you've seen some of that in the downturn. From a socio-demographic perspective, here we're looking at the idea of a lot of major issues that get exacerbated by the downturn and by the pandemic, things like mental health, things like domestic violence, things like isolation in society, and these really don't get addressed very well and actually get exacerbated by it. And the other end of the spectrum is that coming together, a growing sense of community and a real focus on how do we make sure that any recovery really does put healthcare, social care, education, disability, and all the areas of society that may have been less attended to in the run-up to this pandemic, getting much more attention and a much clearer level of support from society, possibly leading to a willingness to pay higher taxes. From a science and technology perspective, then what we see is that at one end of the spectrum, investment would just be down. Governments would be cutting budgets in science and technology for the future. Corporations would be more cautious. And really you'd see a divide between the wealthy, whether that's corporations and individuals, and those who don't have. Those with money would be able to invest and would pull away from the pack even further. And then at the other end, the more positive end of the spectrum, is the idea that governments really prioritize science and technology investment as a way out of this and encourage businesses to invest through their bailout packages. There's the skills investment to go with this. And we start to see the science and technology that could give us abundance, whether that's vertical farming, synthetic biology, new materials, really starting to accelerate across society. And the final one is around the environment, or certainly the final big force we looked at. We're seeing right now that there's been a benefit to the environment in terms of pollution, emissions, water quality, species coming out of the woods to kind of reclaim nature, simply because of the downturn in economic activity. There's, at this end of the spectrum, if things are slow to pick up, then some of those gains could be sustained. But at this end of the spectrum, the expectation is that environmental targets would be sidelined in favor of the dash for growth and the return to sort of economic health. At the other end of the spectrum is a much more positive expectation that actually now we've made these gains, we're going to look to see how we can sustain them. Governments will bake in environmental targets and the sustainable development goals into the bailout packages they give to corporations. Consumers will demand a much more transparent level of reporting around people's environmental footprint and will vote with their pocketbooks, with their wallets, with the cash in their pockets for those businesses that have the most environmentally sound policies. So those are the factors. And as I say, that when you pull those together, they give us these four scenarios. So I'm going to take you through the four scenarios. Then I'll take you through a little bit of what's in the book, the rest of the book, and then we'll take some of the questions that are coming in. What I would encourage you to do is to ask questions in the Q&A and vote for the ones that you think are most interesting to you. So let's start with the long goodbye. So this is one where we see that the old structures, the old systems, the old hierarchies are starting to crumble. They can't be held together. A lot of governments really struggle to do that in weaker, poorer, potentially failing nations. Would see them yo-yo in and out of peaks of the pandemic, really not being able to get it under control in any sense. And a lot of the more developed nations really focusing on themselves for some time, a lot of trade tensions, a lot of political tensions, and so a lot of domestic unrest. But gradually people beginning to realize by the end of 2021 that this has to have a global solution. And you see a coming together of all those institutions we talked about, plus the billionaires, the philanthropists, and the social change agents with the ideas, who come up with the equivalent of a new Marshall Plan, which was, what the US created for the recovery of Europe after World War II. And we see a plan that includes environmental, social, governance, economic, and sexual development programs, as well as the development of individuals and skills. The challenge here will be around, that we see in this scenario, is around selling this to the leaders of the countries most in need, who may not be willing to give up power in order to get support. But ultimately it does get bought into, and what you see is a sort of twinning arrangement in this scenario, where the more developed countries who've come out of this better partner with some of the countries most in need and effectively coach and mentor them through the development of their capabilities. So rather than it being a big amorphous global support thing, it's a very direct partnering, mentoring relationship to move them through this. In the second scenario, this is the one where governments, under pressure from their citizenry in particular, focus their efforts on eradicating the pandemic, bringing it under control, getting widespread testing in, getting widespread antibody testing in, which again, we know none of these are perfect, but then getting vaccinations rolled out as quickly as possible, supporting the rollout of global infrastructure, but accepting that the downturn will take longer to smooth out and turn back up again, that there will be deep costs economically and in terms of jobs, but when we come out the other side, it's more sustainable. It's a slower recovery, but it's one that people believe in, and that on the way up, there's investment in jobs to create the prospects for the future. The third scenario is the VIP economy, and it's interesting when we share this. Often people say, "Well, this is where we are now," and certainly you're hearing this in the rhetoric of certain countries, where you start to see an acceptance that we can't get the pandemic under control. It's going to be something we have to live with. We're not going to have an effective vaccine for some time, but we have to get the economy moving. And we just accept that there's a level of infections and a level of deaths within society that we are going to have to tolerate and acknowledge and just accommodate as we go forward. And you start to see this VIP society where those who seem to be better off and those who government believe can help most in driving the recovery. So whether that's the investors, the business owners, the managers, the employees, the financiers, they're the ones who get earliest access to testing, to vaccination, to quality support. And effectively, social distancing starts to become a structural thing in society where you try and protect those who you see as the wealth creators from those you're worried about who might live in the poor areas with higher infection rates. And within countries, you could start to see those people being cordoned off, and you're actually seeing that already. And you're seeing those kind of disparities in different countries in terms of infection and mortality rates already. So some people say this is kind of where we operate now. And the final one that we call inclusive abundance, and this is indulging my love of chocolate, but also this bakery that in the picture is called Abundance. This is one where there's a kind of mindset shift, and we recognize that we don't come out of this as a planet unless we come out of it together, both from a health perspective, but also from an economic perspective. And so there is this really globally coordinated focus on putting in place the infrastructure around health in a lot of the weaker countries that don't have it today, that are currently having to send their tests away to another country and finding that by the time the test results come back, the patients have either recovered or passed away. This is about putting in place those testing, vaccination, care capabilities into every country, but also moving to a model where we're investing in giving countries the ability to become much more self-sufficient. So however small we are in the world, we're putting in place the vertical farming, the micro factories, the local research and development capabilities, so they don't get affected as much by any future pandemic lockdowns and flight bans and shipping bans. And that extends to, beyond food and goods manufacture using things like 3D printing. That extends to things like making sure that we can actually create small footprint vaccine production facilities in pretty much every country, because that's how you can guarantee that when anything happens, you have the capability locally to roll out a vaccine once it's developed, rather than the rich nations deciding who gets it first and when the poorer nations receive it. This is obviously a very optimistic scenario in which there's an investment in skills, in digital literacy, in the kind of Green New Deal type projects to create the future, much stronger focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, a potential use of universal basic incomes and services, whilst people are retraining either to move into the jobs of the industries of tomorrow or to create their own jobs. However, this shouldn't be seen as a sort of sunlit upland scenario. Not everything is perfect. Many of the tensions we see out there today are still there. Many of the unsolved problems in society remain, but there's progress, and that there's a renewed sense that we have to do this together as a global community to create platforms for the future. So those are the scenarios. I'm going to just quickly take you through the content of the rest of the book, so you've got a sense of what's there. We open the book with a sense of what are some of those big shifts that need to be part of the storyline if we're going to move to a more positive future. Sahel Inyatullah, who many of you know, one of the kind of father figures of the futurist community, one of the creators of many of the techniques we all use, has written a really interesting chapter where he looks at 6 different narratives or dialogues for what the recovery might look like depending on the lens you choose to apply. Liselott Lyngso, very respected futurist from Denmark, has really looked at how the trends that were already starting to be evident before the pandemic are being changed, adapted, amplified in what we might call as a laboratory for the future right now, and how they then might play out in society. And then Miranda Mante, who's someone who wasn't known to us at all, but just came through the call for chapters, really talented foresight researcher from Canada, has explored how social, technological, political innovations are happening and the challenges that are arising as we try and tackle this unseen enemy in using this war metaphor that's become popular. Also within this book, Sheila Moorcroft, one of the most respected futures researchers in the UK, looks at some of the ways that things could change for the better in society, from a greater respect for those essential workers and how they're not just how we come out and clap for them on a Thursday night, but how does their standing in society change, and how does that reflect in the way they're rewarded, the way they're respected, the way they're invested in for the future, and also the kind of pressures that might come on corporates to behave in a better way. Jerry Edling, broadcaster and writer from LA, written a really interesting chapter here about how the advances we're seeing happening at speed in healthcare and healthcare collaboration, research collaboration, could give us a transformed healthcare landscape by 2035. Paul Plant, someone I've known for many, many years, is a kind of global growth advisor and strategist, has looked at a sort of informal survey done in social media about what might change as a result of the pandemic. And he's looked at some of the things where actually we might come out more positive, more caring, more respectful of each other. And then Bruce Lloyd, Professor of Strategic Management at South Bank University in London, has looked at the idea of what if we were to really create a new change agenda, something we touched on in the scenarios, but this idea of a new Marshall Plan for the planet to create economic development for all, coupled with the equivalent of a kind of Beveridge plan. We know in the UK, Beveridge wrote a report in, I think it was 1942, around the kind of social changes needed for UK society. That became the foundations for the sort of 1945 Labour government and their creation of the welfare state and the National Health Service. So Bruce has kind of talked about what would a modern day version of that look like, and what are the principles of how you might drive that. We then have a section on society and social policy. Nell Watson is a AI ethicist and researcher, part of Singularity University. And she's looked at the idea of whether this pandemic is really a kind of shock to the planet, and the chance for us to move towards a more human and planet-centric approach as we go forward. Could we create a more inclusive and caring model of the world? We have a very interesting chapter from Catherine Van Gerp and Mike Richmond from the Australian and New Zealand Policing Authority. They've talked about what are the challenges for policing, what new requirements are emerging for policing in a consent-based society, but also what adaptations are we seeing in criminal behavior, and what does all that imply for the future of policing? Morgan Kaufman, a futurist from the US, again, someone who wasn't known to us, has come up with a really interesting concept of what if we saw this not as a one-off, but something we started to prepare for, and that once every 2 years, we do a pandemic drill across society to make sure that we're ready when a real one comes. And then Julia Hollenbury, a therapist from the UK, has looked at how do we take this as an opportunity to create a new operating system for ourselves, which moves beyond just the focus on the mind and the brain to bringing the heart and the body into that, and a much more holistic way of being that might come out of this as we look ahead. The final 3 chapters in this section then, Sylvia Glusser, another very well-respected futurist, has looked at a scenario where this is a classroom 15 years on into the future. So we're dealing with the children of the baby boom that we expect from the lockdown. And a teacher is reviewing with them some of the social and economic shifts that have happened and the kind of unexpected developments. A fascinating chapter. Joe Tankersley, very well known across the futurist community worldwide, very respected for his consistent challenge to the norm or norm-based thinking. And his chapter really looks at quite a challenging scenario of what happens if we call a victory too early over the pandemic. What could happen to us? And then finally, Alex from our own team has looked at some of the shifts that are happening in terms of the use of our homes and how do they become more widespread in the future, or how could they become more widespread? And how do we make sure that those with the least resources could still participate in the technological and physical changes to our homes that make us more pandemic proof in the future? We then have a section looking at government and economy. We open up by looking at what are some of the things that futurists have been talking about for a while now in terms of using future insights to make yourselves more robust as a country, more prepared for the future. And what are the lessons being learned from this pandemic as it's being dealt with? And how do we build those into planning and the design of future government? David Wood, then chair of London Futurists, very well respected futurist, transhumanist, widely published author, has gone deeper into some of these themes again to say, how do we create the possibility of really tapping into the advances going on in science and technology, the understanding we're developing of why we got into this crisis, and how do we make ourselves more aware, more agile and more alive, and create a more vibrant and more inclusive future for all. And then Jeff Mulgan, many of you may know, he's a professor of collective intelligence at the University College London, was the head of Demos and various other think tanks. And he's looked at what are some of the lessons we're learning from governments around the world in terms of how they're innovating, how they're dealing with the challenges, and how could they be applied to healthcare policy, citizen engagement, and delivering better models of government in the future. Bronwyn Williams, an economist, a futurist and trend watcher from South Africa with an incredible reputation globally, has looked at the issue of the separation that was already there in society and the potential for that to be accelerated both within countries and between nations. Lee Sherp, a futurist and design thinking advisor from the US, has looked at what are some scenarios for America. Most of the country scenarios that we're looking at are in the next book, but we thought the US is so central to the story for everyone that we wanted to include that here. And he looks at this combination of the response to the pandemic, the economic evolution of America, and the outcomes of the next election to paint 4 different possible futures. We then close that section looking at 5 critical economic shifts we think are essential to creating in a more inclusive, socially focused and developmental agenda for the planet that really delivers on the Sustainable Development Goals. The final section then focuses on business and technology. Tom Cheesewright, really well-respected global futurist from the UK, looks at the idea of what if the expected growth in home working doesn't materialize. Right now, a lot of people working from home. He said, you know, what if that doesn't happen for cultural, for social reasons, for all sorts of factors, and explores what some of those drivers might be and what are some of the implications might be if that snapback, if that doesn't happen. Alida Drought, a futurist from the US and a college lecturer in California, has looked at how might we take a more transformative approach to rethinking the future of business that's more inclusive, more socially focused, and more sustainable. And then Robert Caldera, another future strategist from the US, has looked at what might happen, a scenario of what might happen if we take a lot of those innovations that were already taking place in the world of work and in technology, and the kind of adaptations we've made as a result of the pandemic, and you accelerate, you pull those together and they accelerate, and we step into the future and look back at what might have changed within a few years. Also within that chapter, within that section, a fascinating chapter from Robert Saracho, an expert on the notion of digital twins, this idea of having a parallel digital extension of ourselves and how that might help us both deal with the downturn, but what does it mean to think about a world where we have a parallel but complementary existence in the digital world. And finally, we close that chapter looking at what are some of the shifts that are starting to happen as a result of the pandemic and the changes in the way we work, and how might they play out in the coming years. And finally, we take as a conclusion, we take a sort of tour across the many of the ideas in the book and map out an agenda of what we see as sort of 10 critical changes and shifts that need to be part of the agenda in a move towards a more progressive future. And really what we're, you know, when you read the book, I think the critical message that comes across is that all of us have become familiar with certain dance routines. They're embedded in our DNA, whether as individuals, as families, as societies, as businesses, as governments, as nations dealing with each other. We have some very familiar patterns of dancing, some very familiar routines that we return to on a regular basis. The challenge that's really been laid down by the authors across the chapters of this book is to say, we are moving into a world that will be different. How different, we don't yet know. But if we want to tackle some of the biggest challenges facing humanity, if we want to put ourselves on a more sustainable footing for the future, and if we want to avoid the kind of crises that we faced around the world in responding to the panic, then we need to learn some different dance routines, and we need to get much smarter in how we navigate that uncertain future. So hopefully that's made some sense. Get your cameras out. We're offering anyone who's on the webinar right now a 30% discount on the book if you buy it before the launch on June 1st. It is selling well. We are very pleasantly surprised to see how popular it's been. Yeah, so that's the closest we get to an advert. Right, let's stop sharing and take some of the questions that are coming in. I see 9 on my screen. I'm going to just have a quick look. Do vote for the questions that you most want to address. And I'm just going to take them as they come at the moment. But if they get voted on, I'm going to move them. Oh, and David Wood just got voted up. There we go. In the landscape of post-pandemic scenarios, is there scope to consider the extent to which society alters its central cultural assumptions? For example, letting go of the idea of paid work should be in the central activity of most people's lives. Yes and no. I think at one level, people are accepting that this is something that is going to change. Those in the futures world, those looking at technologies and the developments in science that are giving us exponential change and abundance are certainly talking that way. But I think if we look at just the next 2 or 3 years, we certainly couldn't see in the spectrum of the scenarios we looked at, we couldn't see any government anywhere or any society anywhere saying, let's plan for the end of jobs in this period. There's some talk of universal basic income, but certainly no one has implemented it. Please don't get confused with what's going on in Spain. That's not a universal basic income. It's a country imposing a guaranteed minimum wage, which exists in many other places. Canada's giving a payment to its citizens for 4 months. The US is giving a loan. Others are, paying furlough payments, but there is nowhere that anyone has implemented a total universal basic income where everyone just gets a sum of money. Being talked about, no one's embedded it in policy yet, and that would be part of that shift to a new way of thinking. I think if we get to that more inclusive abundance scenario, then I could see us having that kind of conversation more and more come 2022, come 2023, particularly as we start to see a lot of businesses invest more in automation, in AI, in robotic process automation, in hyper automation, where we are genuinely taking jobs out. And we start to take out a lot of professional jobs because we need less of them, because technology can do more and more of their work. And the new industries come through that are more automated or completely employee-free, these sort of decentralized autonomous organizations. I think that conversation will accelerate them, but I don't see that as being part of these scenarios for the next 2 or 3 years. Nick Vine asks, is GDP still the most useful measure of performance for society's benefit? It may not be the most useful, and I think the Sustainable Development Goals are a better, more inclusive set of measures, but even they have largely reduced themselves to 161 more economically measurable targets, because we've so embedded the thinking of GDP and financial growth as being the only answer, that I think in the next 2 or 3 years, it's going to be hard to shed that. But maybe in that journey, particularly again, if we say we have to be more inclusive and we see that the people we might have valued most in society and paid the most to haven't necessarily been the ones that have really done the most to pull us out. The people who are perhaps paid the least in many cases, the essential workers, are the ones we really realized are core to our society. So we might see some different measures. Again, I don't see many countries adopting those, and we certainly couldn't see those in the scenarios in the next 2 or 3 years, but you could see some much broader conversations once we start to get to some level of economic stability, because people are realizing the need for change. Richard Kelm asks, what do you think are the key triggers that would see the world move from one quadrant to another? It's not so much moving from one quadrant to another, I suppose, as which scenario plays out. And the critical ones on the health side are the speed with which governments impose the lockdowns, the restrictions, really restrict the spread of the pandemic, and bring in the effective control measures. So you've seen the countries that have done the best job at this, Hong Kong, 4 deaths, Taiwan, 6 deaths, New Zealand, less than 20, Australia, very low numbers, Singapore, I think, somewhere, pretty low numbers until quite recently. We do know the models that help you get the economy moving again, get people back to confidence. You haven't eradicated it, but you've controlled it within your own country. So part of it is the health measures. Obviously, having widespread testing to see if people have got it will be important. Having widespread testing to see if people have developed the antibodies gives you some indicator, but doesn't guarantee you're protected against all the variants that are emerging. And a vaccination, again, could be helpful, but again, we don't know if it will solve it. On the economic front, I think the critical role here is about government's willingness to invest in keeping people employed and funded while they retrain for new jobs, supporting businesses while they get going again, and investing in the new businesses, and really tying the bailout packages to innovation and investment in a more greener economy going forward. Certainly that's my perspective. Again, obviously I don't have a monopoly on wisdom, but you're asking me. Nick Vine, jumping to the end, how do you see the content of the book being used and by whom? I think it's going to be used in different ways. Hopefully it gives a lot of inspiration to individuals. A lot of the people who are asking us to talk about the book and asking for our contributors to talk are people working with schools and students around the world to give them hope, people wanting to give it to politicians, people wanting to also use it to give insights to those who've been the victims of this. We had a request in this morning for whether we could do something for the communities who've lost their livelihoods in the US and the Caribbean. Could we do something to help them understand the picture and then think about how did they take control or more control of their own destiny in this situation? So I think it's going to be very widespread. what we know is that a lot of the people who are showing the most interest in this are the business community, saying, help us make sense of what some of the possibilities are so that we can map a path to the future. But I think, you know, anyone who's interested in what the future might be should hopefully find some interest in that. Lucy Willis says, and by the way, I'm reading these out straight away, so if they turn out to be a stinker, forgive me. Lucy Willis says, one lesson of COVID-19 is that it is no longer acceptable to leave people behind. As we move to more participatory cultures and systems, especially through digital devices and tools, how to ensure that inclusion is the new norm and that current bias, discrimination are not perpetuated? I'm going to challenge you there, Lucy. I think right now there is this acceptance that it's not right to leave people behind. It's more in the public discourse. It's not necessarily displayed in the behaviors everywhere around the world. You see very different notions of what's going on. Countries underreporting deaths in certain communities, cordoning off certain communities and basically leaving nature to take its course. So I don't think that's a universal discourse right now. And I think we might be kidding ourselves to believe that this is going to be central to the agenda going forward. What we can see, you know, if we look at the country I know best is the UK, and we look at what's being leaked out of the Treasury in terms of their ideas for how we recover, they're talking about a return to austerity measures. They're talking about cutting back public sector salaries. They're talking about cutting spending on the health service, cutting spending on a lot of essential services, cutting back the number of police they were planning to recruit. So the things that we thought were going to happen may not. And some of those critical safety net services like mental health, like social, probation and social work may not get the kind of support that right now we hope they might. My own sense is in this, that in none of those scenarios are we going to see an absolute about face in any country to really put those top of the agenda. I think they'll get more priority in the growth scenarios, but I don't think we're going to see them be prioritized for now. As I said earlier, longer term we might get that, but I don't see COVID-19 as being the turning point right now for that shift into a more inclusive, caring society right now. I think we have to have a longer time frame to think about that. Arthur Weiss. I was interested that working from home may not be a long-term trend. I've started to see economic arguments for this in terms of productivity and also moves away from large central offices. Is this discussed? Also, if this does take place, is anything mentioned about the future of large city centre-based commercial offices, buildings, skyscrapers, etc.? Are they not dual purpose, i.e. housing and office? So there is some mention. Tom Cheesewright talks about the possibility that that doesn't happen. And then others have talked about, what if this does become more of the norm? So a lot of the authors have touched on this and what this could mean. And I think in the next book, there's more focus on the sense of place, on real estate, how it gets repurposed, how do you rethink it? Just take things like convention centres. If we're not going to have conventions coming back anytime soon, although I believe Amsterdam is going to test some next month, they might change. They might become spaces that include, equivalent of the Nightingale hospitals, where you've got small excess capacity hospitals. They might be places where you can have some temporary courts because the courts have to do social distancing and can't put through the capacity they need to of pent up cases. They might become extensions of schools because of social distancing, schools having to move some of their pupils in there for lessons or examinations. You could start to see the repurposing of some of this, and hotels, again, similarly used in that way. High street retail that doesn't reopen, we're going to have to think carefully about that. We haven't gone into it. None of the authors have gone into it in that much depth in this book, but this is one of those more sector-specific themes that will get looked at much more in the next book, and I can say that with some confidence because I'm writing about it. Anonymous attendee, I love anonymous attendee. He comes up everywhere, or she comes up everywhere. How do you think the geopolitical landscape will change? China will lead, Europe will re-emerge? Yeah, so this is an interesting one. China clearly is building its soft influence around the world as well as its hard influence. Prior to the downturn, it had its, its Belt and Road Initiative. You put your own numbers to it, but anywhere from $20 trillion to, $100 trillion being estimated as to the amount of infrastructure investment that was going in to effectively create a new Silk Road through many countries on the planet. Again, the numbers we've seen range from about 60 to 160. I think that will reemerge. I think China is very aggrieved at the way it's being treated around this. A lot of distrust around China around the numbers and the reporting and how it's handled the pandemic, but then a lot of distrust in a lot of countries around how their governments handled it. I think there are huge tensions. The US, a lot depends on what happens in the next election, assuming it goes ahead, and how the US choose to play in the rest of the world. I think the US recovery is heavily dependent on its trade with the rest of the world. But if it gets into a deep and aggressive political and trade war with China in particular, that may not be good for either of them. The challenge for the US is that I think still the largest single holder of US debt is China. So there's a question there of how aggressive you can be to your lender of last resort. And what happens if China decides in an act of pique to start dumping US debt? What does that do to the US economy? Very interesting challenge there for people to look at. So before I go down the list, I'm just going to go, I knew there'd be some, sort of touched on this. David had a question about what scenarios the chapter authors envisage for post-pandemic changes, geopolitical balance, e.g. decline of the US, increasing importance of the East Asian and other countries that have responded well to the pandemic. I think we might start to see new trading blocks emerge based on how people have dealt with the pandemic. So the countries that feel that they are safest and that each other has the best set of pandemic controls might open up their borders to each other. So you could see much strengthened trading blocks between Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, New Zealand, Australia. The question is, can they develop the kind of growth model they want to pursue, just trading with each other, or do they need the big markets of the Americas, of Europe, and the rest of the world? In which case they're open to more risks because there isn't the same level of pandemic control. So I think there is the potential for that. There could also be, another scenario is, what about the countries that have the worst situation? Do they start to trade with each other, more and say, well, look, we just accept that we've all got really high levels of viral spread and death rates, so it's safe to trade with each other. And a lot depends on how countries decide to deal with this right now. There are some very interesting developments happening now where people are saying, we're just going to get on with it. So I mentioned Amsterdam Rye, looking at how do you do socially distance conventions and exhibitions. Hotels looking at how do we do social distance hospitality. I heard about an example from Ras Al Khaimah, one of the Emirates in the United Arab Emirates. They now have a model where basically you can have a hermetically sealed travel experience, that they have travelers mainly from Russia coming in on dedicated flights to a small, effectively private airport in Ras Al Khaimah. They're transported to particular resorts. The guests are effectively quarantined in those resorts. They stay there, they're entertained there. The staff who are there are tested on a regular basis, but it's the same staff all the time. So if someone gets ill, they're taken out, but and they're not allowed to stay within that environment. They're quarantined till they recover. So they're creating this kind of contained experience. And I think you could see a lot more of that. I think you could also see a lot of cases where people simply say, you know what, we're going to get on with it and we're going to live with the risks. A lot depends on insurance companies. So we know that in the meetings industry, a lot of corporate insurers have said to corporations, we will not insure your staff and your health policies are invalidated if you are sending your staff to places where they could get infected by choice. You're okay bringing them to the workplace, you're okay having them at home, but if you deliberately choose to send them on planes across the planet to countries with different levels of risk, or to locations with different levels of risk, or to conventions you're not covered. That could have a massive impact. So I think we're going to see some interesting kind of adaptations and developments to try and deal with this as people try to make the economy move. Okay, let's go down. Landscape. Jump into the end. Let's look at it. Arthur, we've dealt with you. David Wood again. Do any chapters consider the interaction of the pandemic and Brexit? As we futurists know, the biggest changes often arise from combinations of more than one trend. Yeah, a few of the chapters deal with it, but we've tried in this book not to be too UK focused, although some of the authors are from the UK. There's more of a consideration of this in the second book. And it is a fascinating landscape. We're hearing two totally different stories, aren't we? On the one hand, we're hearing the UK government say we're all on course, we're going to deliver Brexit. And then we're hearing the EU saying the UK is being more intransigent than ever and really isn't enabling a deal to happen. So this is going to be a challenge. The question will be, who do we want to trade with in the future? So we've already done an interesting deal where we've said most people coming into the country will have to be quarantined unless they're a truck driver, or they happen to be an important business person, or they're coming from France. So it's kind of slightly odd, So we're already doing side deals with parts of Europe or the EU. How that plays out, I think, is going to be very interesting. And I would say that we need a couple more months. Either this, the pandemic in the UK peaks again, and all the focus is back on that, or if things get under control, then you could see a greater focus on the Brexit agenda. And the question there is, does anything about the pandemic and our response to it shape the Brexit strategy? The one thing that I think could have a big influence is the state of public finances. And the idea was that we were going to be part of, it was going to be global Britain, we were going to trade with the rest of the world. Well, if the rest of the world we're talking about trading with has high levels of infection, then how willing are British business people going to be to travel across the world to try and get an order if they risk bringing back more than, an order for their goods? And so I think that's going to be quite an interesting tension to play out. It's not explored massively in this book, but it is something that gets covered more in the next one. Tanuja Prasad, in describing your quadrants, you have used the phrase, see this happen, that's passive. I want to see an active choosing of one of the quadrants and then pursuing it with vision, strength, purpose, thoughts. Well, that's a policy choice, isn't it? We can't make policy choices for people. I think effectively it is being chosen. I would say that a lot of countries are choosing the VIP economy quadrant, not exactly as we described it, but this idea of pursuing parallel paths. That on the one hand, you're trying to drive an economic rebound, and you want to keep that going. On the other, you're doing what you can to contain the pandemic, but you don't expect it to come under control. And again, here in the UK, we're seeing ministers now. Our business secretary said yesterday, we may never have a vaccination. There's a kind of gentle softening up of the public to this idea that this might be with us permanently in the way that influenza is, and we might just have to accept a higher level of deaths in society. And we've been softened up to be told that those who are dying tend to be older or in poorer communities or with other underlying conditions. So we're also being given a rhetoric that says, understand who we might lose in this and make your own choices about how important they are. But yeah, I don't think anyone would choose bottom left quadrant, and I doubt that anyone would choose bottom right. It feels like most people are choosing top left in their current government strategies, but most, I'm sure, would say they aspire to top right. Michael Barrett, how will airports need to rethink passenger flows, not just through security and immigration, but also through the commercial areas? How will they create new revenue opportunities as passengers refrain from entering shops? Well, this is what they're wrestling with right now. And you know, we're seeing lots of them experimenting with this, closing retail, creating certain flows through the airports. A lot of work going on at the moment to actually use things like heat maps and real-time tracking of passengers through the airport to see where they go, to see how different social distancing strategies work, whether it's at check-in or immigration or security. What do we do to try and maintain that? And if you've got passengers coming off a plane and going onto a plane, how do you keep them apart? What do you do at the gates? All of this is being explored. The problem, I think, is that every single airport is going their own way. There's guidance coming from Airport Council International. There's guidance coming from IATA to the airlines. There's guidance coming from the global regulatory bodies, but ICAO, but it's not being applied consistently, and it's not detailed enough for a lot of them. I think what would give a passengers confidence is if you had a very similar process everywhere where you went, and if you were connecting somewhere, it felt very similar. I think retail, there's a lot of talk of moving towards pop-up stores where you don't actually buy anything, you don't touch anything in the store, you pay for it and it's delivered to your home or you pick it up at your destination. But this idea of we take away physical stock, we take away the opportunity for you to handle things, and it becomes much more of a display facility, is one of the things that's being talked about. Again, lots of talk at the moment, not a lot of action, and that's largely because there aren't many passengers flying. One of the big issues is what strategies airports and airlines adopt around testing. At the moment, some are saying, when you get to the airport, we'll do some sort of testing. Emirates are doing that in Terminal 3 in Dubai. Austria does it as you arrive in Vienna, you can pay for that. I think Iceland gives you an optional test. Others are saying, actually, if you wait until you get to the airport to be temperature tested or to see if you've got the virus, that's too late because you could have infected people. And it's far better for people to have that testing done off-site, whether it's in the airport car park or before you book your ticket. And there's a lot of talk about maybe having a stamp in your passport, effectively having an immunity visa that says you've had vaccination or you've had an antibody test, and therefore you can go into the airport. And you could start to see segregation within the airports and even on planes, where you say that there's a zone for the people who've been vaccinated, there's a zone for the people who've had an antibody test, and there's a zone for people who we've given an antigen test to. And you might try and keep them separate all the way through the airport. It's all up for grabs. Everyone's trying stuff. Everyone's implementing solutions. Every technology vendor on the planet believes they've got your solution, the solution for you. Some are genuine. Some, just having better display boards, I don't think is the answer. Let's look at Diane Edwards. My interest is in the potential impact of the pandemic on the supply chain, particularly as it impacts world trade and political economic shifts occurs. To what extent is this explored in the book? This is explored really well by Miranda Mante, and others have touched on it, but supply chains are changing. So in Canada, for example, they've now started to sign strategic supply agreements with local manufacturers for all sorts of things that they've struggled to get hold of during the pandemic. And they're starting 5-year contracts so that these companies can build up their local capability and supply locally. And I think we're going to see more and more of that, where countries build up more capability. One of the scenarios we explore is in the abundance scenario. One of the things we see happening there, or potentially happening there, is a deliberate choice to build up local manufacturing capability in every country using smaller footprint factories, so that no one is dependent totally on global trade for everything they need. And with things like 3D printing and other kind of rapid manufacturing techniques and smaller footprint solutions, we can do more of this. And I think a lot of the big corporations are in this conversation right now about, do we want to have the risks of having manufacturing in what used to be seen as the right strategy of a few key locations from which we service the planet? Now, when those locations get closed down, we're in trouble. So do we take on the responsibility for building a global manufacturing footprint with all that entails and the level of investment that involves? Or do we become more of an IP vendor? Do we create the original research and development and then license that to local manufacturers in these countries who build up local capability? That's a debate that's going on. You're seeing some moves already. Inevitably, you're seeing some of the countries in the Middle East moving fastest on that because they have these long-term ambitious development plans that they're not sidelining. And they're actually saying, what do we do to accelerate that? So we could see more of that going on. And I think all around the world we'll see that. How that impacts the countries that are the manufacturing centers and breadbaskets of the world will be very interesting, and how they adapt, I think, is fascinating. My good friend Jamil Janjua has asked a question. Why will be this, what will be the globally recognized currency? Is the Chinese yen taking over the dollar? So the renminbi has already become more of a trading currency of choice with a lot of China's partners. China's moving to create its own digital currency. And you could see a point in time where if the US is too aggressive towards China, China starts to insist that people trade with it in renminbi. And with a number of countries that are now dependent on China for job creation, for investment, for the sourcing of product and the purchase of their product, that could be quite a transformative force. Do I see this happening in the next 2 or 3 years? Possibly. I think it will be more soft power than a hard shift, that you'll see a gradual shift, see how the marketplaces evolve. Sebastian Ewan, we are all experiencing grief. I lost my father and a friend. I'm sorry to hear that, Sebastian. And the loss of our normal lives. I think there will be huge levels of trauma globally. How do you think this will affect society, and how could we heal? Well, so a couple of the chapters in the book talk about this. Julia Hollenbury's chapter talks about the healing, and Noel Watson's talks about kind of planetary healing. And a lot of people touch on this need to deal with the trauma. I know in my own family, there's an issue right now about my nieces and whether they send their kids back to school, because they're saying their kids like to play with their friends. And if they're told to sit in boxes in the playground, they don't think they'll observe that, because they're just not like that. And then they'll be in trouble all the time. So do they send them back to school knowing that this will be 6 weeks of them being continuously told off? I think there's a lot of these issues coming through, and we've already had, record levels of people leaving work because of mental health issues around the world. I think it costs the global economy over $7 trillion from stress and mental health issues. This is not going to go away. It's going to get exacerbated. And I think there's a question about what kind of mechanisms do we create to deal with it? One is these community support mechanisms you've seen spring up around the world, where people will support people. And I think those are great, but I don't think they're the only thing. I think a lot of the time we need professional help. We need grief counselors. We need psychotherapeutic support to help us overcome the fear of leaving our homes again to go back to work. So many people I know are saying, I don't want to get on a plane again. I don't want to go out to an office again. I want to stay in my little hermetically sealed bubble and go out to the shops when I need to, or get the food delivered to my door, wait until the delivery person is gone and then open my door to pick it up. So there is going to have to be some support. How much that's being prioritized, I don't know in different countries. I see some countries trying to do a decent job around that. I hear Finland's got quite a lot of mechanisms that it's putting in place around that. I think New Zealand did proportionally way more than most people, and had, proportionally a far less severe pandemic. So, we're going to have to look for best practice examples around the world of what people have done and try and scale them up. I'm going to just get back up, see if anything's got voted back to the top of the list. Tony Hunter, a global food specialist. How many changes will be permanent and how many transitory? That's really interesting. I don't know. It's hard to know what might happen. I think Some of the changes around being more caring at the community level, some of those mechanisms will sustain. I think the respect for essential workers, it'd be really interesting to see how we are towards them in 6 months' time. You know, will the world still be coming out once a week to applaud essential workers? If this is going on for another 6 months, I don't know. Will it be reflected in policy? And you know, my daughter's just graduated as a medic. And her view is that, you know, what she's hearing from staff in the NHS is the applause is nice, but they don't like the language. They don't like the language of being called heroes, because it, you know, rather than them being sacrificial, they're now being placed as heroes. And they're saying, no, look after us, give us the training we need, give us the equipment we need, do more testing, rather than just calling us heroes all the time, because that doesn't solve the problem. And I think that those are some of the things we need to look at, is, you know, how the rhetoric in society changes. How does the allocation of resources change? How does the relative prioritization of different groups within society change? The thing that I think will be permanent, I think the shift towards more home working will be more solidified. I think the rise in digital literacy that's come with that is a good thing. I think companies now being more aware that they need to think about the future and think about a range of possible shocks much more seriously. Nothing can be off the table now. Developing more future-focused leaders who can think around corners, I think, is a great thing. I think hopefully some countries do that, both in their political leaders, but also in the machinery of government. And we've seen some places, you know, where the machinery of government has just not been able to adapt well to working in crisis mode, and it had no anticipatory capability, it had no preemptive measures. So I think some of that might change as well, but it might not change as fast as we think, because people will be in crisis for some time to come. Let's look at this. Anonymous attendee, interesting question. As you are publishing future scenarios regarding a situation that is still in development, is there a chance that the book is rapidly outdated? Well, that's the whole challenge with scenarios, isn't it? The shorter term scenario you look at, the more quickly you get to seeing whether it's real or not. But these aren't predictions, and these are explorations of change and possibilities. So I think even if we were in 5 years, sitting here in 5 years' time talking about it, most of the ideas, most of the concepts would still be relevant. If I'm honest, I'd say at least half of them still won't be enacted in the way we'd like to see them, and in the way the authors would like to see them. So I think a lot of this stuff will still be relevant and will still be valid in 5 years' time. And if anyone's still buying the book in 5 years' time, I thank you on behalf of the entire Talwar family. Why are there no non-Western perspectives? Well, I think there are. I mean, we talked about developing nations. There's writers from across the globe, so I think there are. I mean, I just haven't maybe emphasized them enough here. Shahira De Silva, what happens if we have a major virus that crashes all digital connectivity, the internet cloud connectivity, and erases all digital content? Stay for 6 months. I think there's a very short answer to that. We're in trouble. I don't think we have the protective measures in place. Equally, even having had this crisis, I don't know to what extent governments and businesses would want to put in place the kind of protective measures you would need for that kind of obliteration of our digital infrastructure. Some might say that would be a good thing because it would take us all back to the subsistence lifestyle. We'd adapt quickly, we'd learn, we'd evolve, and then plenty of films with that kind of scenario in them. Sebastian Ewan, how are we doing on time? 1917. Some say the fourth industrial revolution is likely to be accompanied by a revolution, uprising, civil unrest. How bad could that be? How widespread is the inevitable? From what you've just said, it is just one possible outcome, local and regional rather than global. Is this inevitable? Oh, right, yeah. So, yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, you've already seen, you know, minor level, you could see technology platforms for doing the things that we've always done, like taxis, Airbnb, Uber. There's been civil unrest, there've been protests, there've been all sorts of things against those types of platforms. I think there will be mass objection if governments don't put mechanisms in place to retrain people and to support them in advance of large-scale technological unemployment. I think the people who are saying that AI will create more jobs, I find most of the evidence for that stretching credibility right now, because they're talking about creating jobs as data scientists, as AI ethicists, as machine learning programmers, and et cetera, et cetera. Those are great. But if you're losing your job as a checkout assistant in a retail store because you're replaced by a machine, or a security guard replaced by a robot, or a lawyer where 70% of your work is replaced by a piece of software, and so we just don't need as many of you, I don't see those people retraining that quickly into those new roles. So I think there will be a period of technological unemployment. We can shorten it if we invest in the skills, if we help people train into new jobs, and we provide the support for new industries. We probably need some sort of universal basic income, or maybe it's a conditional basic income, I don't know, for the people who really need it to help them train into new jobs. We need the mechanisms. And I don't think it will be universal across the globe happening at the same space. I think countries will have different debates. Romy Shelton, how do you see the UK accommodation for hospitality sector doing? I don't know, Romy, but for your particular retreat centre, I'm sure business will boom. I think we're going to see, this summer will be interesting to see how many people choose to take staycations. One of my best mates was telling me yesterday, he's already booked a week off in Cornwall in June. Going to take his kids down there, and people are starting to do that. So I think we might see a little boom as people are reluctant to leave the country, but with the restrictions having been lifted around movement around the country and all that, I think you could see local solutions, local hospitality solutions getting a bit of a boom. The question is, what happens to those companies? Because we've already seen some of the people providing those solutions saying, actually, I don't want you to travel from London to Ironbridge to come and stay in my Airbnb or my bed and breakfast or my hotel, because I don't want the risk of you bringing something here. And so I'd rather stay closed for a while longer. So we're going to have to see both what incentives there are, what mechanisms there are for local protection, how people respond in localities. There's a government task force on hospitality right now saying what it should do, or looking at what it should do. So I think you're going to see a really spotty mix of things, but I think there will be a demand from people who've been locked up to get out and go somewhere, probably in the UK. So it could deliver a temporary boom. I don't know long term whether that will sustain. Sebastian Ewan. We're increasingly seeing the flaws of the traditional factory model of education. Home education by unprepared, unsupported parent teachers has been a struggle, especially juggling with work. How do you see education changing? There's a difference between how I'd like to see it change and how it will change. The hope is that we recognize the importance of education in the coming years. We put a lot of investment in, we shorten, we reduce class sizes, we put more and more emphasis on giving people skills for life that allow them to move from job to job and to navigate life, so that we're developing the whole person, not economic units of production. So that's things like learning how to learn, learning how to collaborate, learning how to solve problems, learning how to regulate yourself, learning how to deal with conflict, all of those things that help us be better citizens, connect better. You'd hope that that's there. And we can look at places like Finland again that just seem to be way in advance on this. The hope is we move to more of that, where the classroom becomes a place of facilitated learning, where it's a place of discovery, of discussion, of being coached through the things that you didn't understand on the things that you taught yourself with the technology at home, or you know, through your own self-learning. Will we get there quickly? I don't think so. But the hope is that we move that way. I think you'll see some countries move there faster. Others will move to much more of that machine-based model that says everything is scripted, everything is done by technology, the marking's done by technology, the students are taught by technology, what the teachers say is scripted, and it's a very automated process designed to deliver exam results. And that's not one I'm attracted by, but you can see a lot of emphasis on that, particularly in developing nations who are saying, how do we move people up the learning curve, the education curve faster? Lucy Willis says, thank you, Rohit. I do agree that austerity is a significant challenge to inclusion. However, grassroots responses have the potential to deliver at scale, and there is a strong interest in this at policy level. Isn't one of the roles of futurism to challenge austerity, if for no other reason that it just pushes expenditure to the future and increases many costs in the long term? Absolutely agree that I mean, future thinking has to get people thinking about a range of possibilities and the consequences of our choices. I think there are grassroots movement, but ultimately, if you really want to make change in a lot of these areas, you need provision. You need homes for those who are currently on the streets. You need intense support for people with multiple behavioral problems or issues. You know, you need ready access to on-demand, free at the point of consumption mental health care. We don't have those. I don't know that we'll see enough of that happening in the next couple of years to see a dramatic sea change. I think the grassroots initiatives are great, and I think they will provide a level of support and some sort of safety net, but I don't think they'll bring about the transformation of society. And I think we just have to accept, as much as that it's unpleasant to do that, that they may not be prioritized in the next couple of years. David Wood. Given the likelihood that many of the good suggestions in these chapters won't have been progressed in the next 5 years, isn't the takeaway homework question, how can we restructure our various processes and institutions to raise the priority of improving society's execution of these projects? And that's why you've written the chapter, David, because I totally agree. Yeah, I mean, it's exactly that. And that's why, you know, a lot of the book is talking about capacity building and what do we need to do to make sure that we actually have the mechanisms in place in society to not constantly be fighting everything as a crisis, to actually be dealing things in a more preemptive way. I mean, one of the things I would say from the UK, which is what I know best, is that we've had preparedness exercises in the past. Futurists have been talking about the risks of pandemics and big health shocks forever. We've done them, but we've only paid lip service to them. We haven't resourced well enough to deliver on them. So a lot of the things that we've ended up doing in crisis mode should have been there as preparatory actions, like having the mechanism to mobilize extra doctors and nurses. Those systems should be in place. Having local suppliers that you can turn on to manufacture protective equipment should be in place. You know, having robust local supply chains for critical health resources, having a supply chain that works in crisis. You know, how long did we hear about PPE being a supply chain issue, not a volume issue? Having local testing capabilities, yes, lots of those things. And then having mechanisms, and this is, I mean, all these are talked about by not only you in the book, but others. Things like having the mechanisms to transfer money to society, whether it's businesses or individuals, because we know there will be all sorts of situations where that could be required. A well-prepared government has mechanisms where it can transfer money quickly. So you're not saying, well, if you're self-employed, you're waiting till June to get a payment, simply because we won't have the mechanisms in place. And so there's a lot of thinking needs to be done on that. And I think if one thing comes out of this, and if one thing comes out of the book, it's people having better mechanisms and putting much more focus on those processes. Would have done a really good job. You included, David, with your excellent chapter. What happens to, Tony Hunter says, what happens to the 45-year-old chicken packer with 2 kids and a mortgage? Well, you know, and there are any other number of jobs that fall into that category. This is the question that governments need to be getting their heads around, is what are we going to do about those people whose jobs may have been, the loss of their jobs may have been accelerated by the downturn, but they were potentially going to be automated anyway. Starting to think about what are we doing to put in place mechanisms across society to train people for the jobs of the future, to reskill them, to support them while they're retraining, to build up that training capacity. And that's not just the capacity in terms of educators, but also in terms of the people, the resources, the facilities. So, you know, one of the shocking crimes I think about the education system is how little the facilities are used. If you look at most schools, they're used about 25 to 30% of the available time across the year if you take evenings and weekends. University lecture theatres are used about 9% of the time. So we can take those facilities and we can start to retrain people in those. We can have classes in the evenings or through the night if you're a day shift worker, where you can learn the skills of the future. We can start to use the existing facilities, people in the community who are experts in those fields, bringing in the people who are setting up the synthetic biology companies or whatever to talk to potential employees, to tell them what the kind of jobs are, what the skills they need are, so that you're hearing it from the employers as to what they need, and real support for people to make this transition, whether it's starting your own business, whether it's retraining for a new business. What we can't do is put our head in the sand. What we can do is encourage people to start learning. One of the big things I think about the downturn is a lot of people have invested in their learning. But again, that's giving people access, that's giving people technology, and Sebastian talked about this. I didn't cover this, but how do we make sure that there's universal provision? One of the crimes, I think, of this this lockdown is that the kids who come from well-off backgrounds, well-resourced schools, have each had their own laptop or their own tablet or whatever. They've been able to carry on a near normal school day. The kids from less well-resourced schools are getting papers sent to them through the post, or the parent is having to go and collect them from the school, or worse still, teachers are having to go door to door to hand bits of paper to the kids. That can't be right, that in this period of a few months, we've actually accelerated the gap between the best resourced and the worst resourced, because the best resourced are learning new skills, they're doing cool stuff. The teachers are learning how to manage those classes and are thinking about how they deliver differently in the future, because the kids can do more self-taught learning, and the teachers can focus much more on supporting them. Whereas a lot of the teachers in the least well-resourced schools are thinking just about how are they going to deal with the emotional and adjustment issues of their kids coming back to school, who haven't been learning very much, haven't been doing their schoolwork, haven't been connecting with their friends, and they're going to have to adjust to a new socially distanced way of being. We've got huge challenges at every level of the system. What we need are the mechanisms to start encouraging that reskilling, particularly for people who are, lost their jobs now, because a lot of the jobs that they would have gone for aren't going to be available, because they're also going to be automated or they're going to disappear. Right, I think I'm going to make this the last question because we are almost there. Sebastian thanking David Wood. My aged eye is saying that we pretty much covered everything. Oh, no, this one. Phil DeFara. Did you find a new narrative for a neo-humanist global consciousness post the pandemic as the most critical factor or force to implement? It wasn't the overriding view that was driving all the chapters. I think there's an element of it in everyone's thinking, that there's some sort of new consciousness driving many of the ideas. The two who've talked most about that are Nell Watson, who talks about this idea of going back to a more human, planet-centric view of the future and a more social consciousness focus. It's also picked up in the Leader Droughts chapter, and it's the core of Julia Hollenbury's chapter. Really a kind of different consciousness driving us. She calls it an operating system. So yeah, it is there. And certainly some of the chapters in the second book also touch on this. There are so many possibilities there as well. Which version of a new consciousness do we buy into? Because if you read any of the stuff out there, everyone seems to put the word quantum into their conversation about consciousness, but what does it mean? What do we mean by a new consciousness and a new awareness? What are the storylines? What are the models? So thank you very much for an excellent flow of questions. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying, if you did stay throughout. Welcome any feedback on this. We're experimenting with models all the time. I just want to tell you about a couple of things coming up. So next Sunday, we have our first in a series of broader panel sessions where myself and three of the contributors to the book are going to talk in depth about the ideas in their chapter and then broader issues. And we're going to do that every Sunday evening for several weeks now, so that each of the authors gets a chance to talk. And then on June the 1st, we have a crazy day. It's going to be a 12-hour day from 10 a.m. in the morning to 10 p.m. at night UK time, where throughout the day you're going to hear, hopefully, from most of the authors, where they'll talk a little bit about the content of their chapter. And then after a couple of talks, we'll have a broader discussion about some of the issues that come out of that and the implications. You'll have one registration for the whole day. You'll be able to dip in and out. There'll be lots of comfort breaks, not least because I need them, but 12 hours is a long time. So there will be breaks for you to go get food, whatever, if you want to sit through the whole thing. We'll publish the schedule so you can see it, but I would register now, or as soon as we advertise the link, because we're pretty sure that all the places for that will go very fast, given some of the other seminars we've done, how quickly the number of places have gone. We're expecting those to go pretty quickly. And then if you register, you'll also make sure you get access to the videos afterwards. So thank you for coming. Remember to go buy the book, tell all your friends to buy the book, and have a wonderful future and enjoy the read. Thank you all. Goodbye.